By late 1943, the balance of the Pacific War had shifted. After the brutal struggle on Guadalcanal, U.S. forces began advancing across the Central Pacific under Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping strategy. The goal was to capture critical islands, build airfields, and cut off Japanese garrisons, bypassing those that could be left to wither in isolation. The next target was the Gilbert Islands, specifically the small atoll of Tarawa, located about 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. At the heart of Tarawa was BDO Island, less than 3 miles long, but heavily fortified. On its narrow strip of sand, the Japanese had built what was considered an impregnable fortress. Why BTO? Because it held an airfield that the Japanese had constructed in 1942. That strip could threaten supply lines and become a launch point for further operations. If the Americans captured it, it would serve as a stepping stone toward the Marshall Islands, the next phase in the U.S. drive across the Pacific. Facing the Marines was a garrison of about 4,800 men under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki. They had spent over a year turning BDO into a fortress. Japanese engineers built bunkers of reinforced concrete, trenches covered with palm logs, and coastal defense guns salvaged from old warships. Machine gun nests were interlocked to cover the beaches with withering fire, and the reef surrounding the island was strewn with obstacles designed to trap landing craft. The Americans sent in the 2nd Marine Division, about 18,000 strong, commanded by Major General Julian C. Smith. Its regiments, the 2nd, 6th, and 8th Marines, had already tasted combat on Guadalcanal. They were supported by artillery, engineers, tanks, and Navy Seabees. For fire support, a powerful task force of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers assembled offshore. The plan was straightforward on paper. A heavy naval and aerial bombardment would neutralize Japanese defenses, then Marines would storm ashore using amphibious tractors, LVTs, and landing craft, LCVPs. The problem was that intelligence underestimated both the strength of the Japanese fortifications and the tidal conditions around Tarawa. The reef that encircled BDO posed a deadly obstacle. At high tide, landing craft could float over it. At low tide, they would be stranded hundreds of yards from the shore, forcing Marines to wade in under fire. Reconnaissance suggested tides would be favorable, but that assumption proved fatally optimistic. On November 20, 1943, at 5 a.m., the American bombardment began. Battleships like the Maryland and Colorado and carriers like the Enterprise pounded BDO. Shells churned the island into smoke and flame, leveling buildings and toppling palm trees. From the decks of transport ships, Marines cheered, believing nothing could survive such punishment. General Smith himself later admitted he thought the bombardment would make the landing almost easy. But on BDO, many of the Japanese had taken shelter in their fortified positions, protected by thick walls of coral and concrete. When the guns ceased and the order came for the Marines to hit the beaches, hundreds of Japanese weapons were still intact, waiting silently for the Americans to come. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest amphibious assaults in U.S. Marine Corps history. In the hours to come, the 2nd Marine Division would discover the true meaning of the phrase carved into a Japanese officer's orders before the battle. It will take 1 million men 100 years to conquer BDO. At 9 a.m., the first wave of Marines began their run toward BDO's beaches. In total, more than 5,000 men would make the initial assault, packed into amphibious tractors known as LVTs, landing vehicle, tracked. These ungainly but rugged machines could crawl over reefs, unlike the more common Higgins boats, LCVPs. The plan was for LVTs to carry Marines all the way to the beach, while LCVPs would follow with reinforcements and supplies. But almost immediately, problems surfaced. The tide was lower than expected, disastrously so. Many LCVPs grounded on the reef nearly 500 yards from shore. Marines inside had no choice but to clamber out and wade across chest-deep water under enemy fire. Officers had warned of this possibility, but few could have predicted how lethal it would be. As the first LVTs approached the beaches, Japanese gunners held their fire. They waited until the Marines were fully committed, then unleashed everything. Machine guns stitched the water with bullets. Mortars and artillery zeroed in on the incoming waves. From concrete bunkers, 13mm machine guns raked across the shallows, cutting down Marines by the dozen. Men of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, who were in the center of the assault, were particularly hard hit. One survivor later recalled, "We had to run the last 300 yards in water up to our armpits. Bullets were slapping the water everywhere. Guys went under and didn't come up. The lagoon was red before we even touched the sand. Amphibious tractors managed to crawl over the reef, but many were destroyed before they reached land. A few tanks made it ashore, only to bog down in soft sand or be knocked out by Japanese anti-tank guns. The beaches themselves were a nightmare, narrow strips of sand raked by fire from 3 sides. Palm log seawalls blocked movement inland, trapping Marines in killing zones where grenades and mortar shells rained down. One LVT carrying Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was hit squarely by artillery. Survivors stumbled into the surf, only to be cut down as they tried to swim. Another group, pinned behind the seawall, described huddling shoulder to shoulder, bodies piled up around them as they waited for a chance to push forward. The courage of individuals stood out amid the chaos. Sergeant William Bordelon, an engineer with the 1st Battalion, 18th Marines, landed under heavy fire to destroy enemy positions blocking the beach. Wounded repeatedly, he kept working, setting charges and dragging fellow Marines to cover. He was killed after clearing a 4th bunker, later posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Command and control were nearly impossible. Radios shorted out in the seawater, officers were killed within minutes of landing. Battalion commanders lost contact with their companies. In the confusion, some units landed on the wrong beaches, while others became intermingled. The carefully drawn invasion plans disintegrated in the first hour. By noon, General Smith, watching from offshore, realized his division was in peril. Casualties were already staggering, over 1,000 Marines killed or wounded in the first hours. But despite the chaos, footholds had been gained. Small groups of Marines clung to the beach, firing back at pillboxes and clawing their way over the seawall. One officer described the scene bluntly. "We were all jammed up on that little strip of sand. The air was full of lead. There wasn't any cover but bodies. If you moved, you got hit. If you stayed still, you got hit." And yet the men kept going. By nightfall of the first day, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered catastrophic losses but held a thin, tenuous grip on BDO. The cost of securing just a few hundred yards of ground had already shocked commanders. The question was whether those battered footholds could expand into a beachhead, or whether the Japanese defenders would push the Marines back into the sea. When dawn broke on November 21st, BDO looked like a scene from hell. The beaches were strewn with wrecked LVTs, burned-out tanks, and the bodies of fallen Marines and Japanese defenders alike. Smoke curled from shattered palm trees, and the seawater was still stained red. Despite the carnage, the 2nd Marine Division held small but vital footholds on the island, precarious lodgements that needed to be linked if the assault was to succeed. The Japanese defenders had suffered heavily on the first day, but their will to resist was unbroken. They had carefully prepared interlocking fields of fire and bunkers that could survive near-direct hits. The Marines faced the brutal task of reducing these strongpoints one by one, often in hand-to-hand combat. Early that morning, reinforcements from the 6th Marines began landing to support the exhausted 2nd and 8th Marines already onshore. Again, the tide complicated landings, but by sheer determination more men and supplies reached the beach. General Julian Smith issued orders to consolidate the fragmented beachheads and push inland toward the airfield at the center of BDO. Progress was slow and costly. Japanese defenders fought fanatically from reinforced pillboxes. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads became the key to survival. Engineers, working under constant fire, crawled up to enemy positions with satchel charges. Once the blast blew apart the walls, Marines rushed in with grenades and rifles to clear the survivors. One Marine recalled, "Every yard cost lives. We had to burn them out, blow them out, or shoot them out. There was no other way." The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines made a particularly gallant stand on the eastern beaches. Pinned down by machine gun fire, they inched forward using the wrecks of LVTs as cover. Casualties mounted so high that companies were reduced to platoons, yet they pressed on, slowly widening the perimeter. Meanwhile, Japanese counterattacks erupted throughout the day. Small groups of defenders charged from bunkers, sometimes armed only with bayonets or grenades. In one incident near the western beaches, a group of Marines was nearly overrun before naval gunfire from offshore destroyers intervened, blasting the attackers apart. Naval and aerial support proved crucial. Destroyers steamed dangerously close to shore, firing point-blank into enemy positions. Carrier-based planes strafed and bombed behind Japanese lines, though coordination was often difficult due to poor communication with forward observers on the island. By nightfall on November 21st, the Marines had advanced inland, capturing part of the airfield. The eastern and western forces were beginning to link up, though the Japanese still held strongpoints in the center and west of the island. Casualties remained staggering, another 1,500 Marines killed or wounded that day. Amid the bloodshed, acts of heroism stood out. Corporal Harold Epperson, manning a machine gun, held off a Japanese charge long enough for his platoon to regroup, dying at his weapon. Another Marine, Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., led an assault against a massive Japanese bunker complex, personally directing flamethrowers and charges. Though killed in action, Bonnyman's leadership helped crack one of the strongest defenses on BDO. He too would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. As darkness fell, sporadic Japanese attacks continued, often infiltrations through the rubble. Marines dug foxholes amid the bodies, listening nervously for movement in the night. Many later admitted they expected the Japanese to mount a massive counterattack that could drive them back into the sea. But the defenders were themselves running out of men and ammunition. The second day of Tarawa was a grim confirmation. BDO would not fall easily. But it also proved the resilience of the 2nd Marine Division. Against almost unimaginable firepower and in conditions no training could have prepared them for, the Marines had clawed inland. The island's fate was far from decided, but the momentum was beginning, slowly, painfully, to tilt toward the Americans. By the morning of November 22, 1943, the Marines had endured 2 days of constant battle. Exhaustion was etched on every face. Units that had landed with hundreds of men were reduced to handfuls. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies stretched thin, and the beaches were still littered with the wrecks of burned-out LVTs and the dead. Yet, despite the chaos, the Marines now controlled nearly 2/3 of BDO. The Japanese, though fanatical in their defense, had been pushed into a shrinking pocket on the western end of the island. Admiral Shibazaki, who had sworn the island would never fall, had been killed the previous day by naval gunfire. His death deprived the defenders of central leadership, though surviving officers continued to fight on with grim determination. On the morning of the 22nd, General Julian Smith issued his orders. The Marines would coordinate attacks to seize the remainder of the airfield and drive west. The 8th Marines advanced across the center, while the 6th Marines, freshly committed to the battle, began their push on the right flank. Tanks, though few remained operational, played a critical role in blasting bunkers apart. The amphibious tractors that survived were used to ferry ammunition and wounded, though many had been destroyed in the first 2 days. One of the most decisive actions came when Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. led an assault on a massive Japanese bunker complex nicknamed the Command Post. Bonnyman personally directed flamethrower teams and demolition squads as they fought bunker by bunker. At one point, he climbed onto the roof of a stronghold, firing his pistol to cover his men before being cut down by enemy fire. His leadership helped crack open the Japanese line. For his heroism, Bonnyman was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Elsewhere, small groups of Marines improvised their way forward. Engineers used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in wire entanglements. Seabees, normally builders rather than fighters, joined the line to carry ammo and man machine guns. Flame and demolition became the language of progress. Every bunker destroyed meant another yard of ground gained. Japanese resistance was ferocious. Machine gunners refused to abandon positions even when surrounded. Snipers concealed in the ruins of palm log fortifications picked off Marines at close range. In one desperate counterattack, about 200 Japanese soldiers charged the lines of the 6th Marines. Few survived the withering rifle and machine gun fire that met them. By late afternoon on the 22nd, the Marines had secured the entire airfield and effectively split the island in two. The remaining Japanese defenders were compressed into the western tip of Bidio, their supplies dwindling and morale shaken. Still, there would be no surrender. Japanese doctrine forbade it. For them, to fight to the death was both an expectation and an honor. That night, Marines prepared for yet another assault, digging shallow foxholes in coral sand still reeking of cordite and decay. The cries of the wounded mixed with the sound of sporadic gunfire as Japanese infiltrators probed American lines. Flares lit the sky intermittently, revealing shadowy figures crawling forward only to be cut down by alert riflemen. By this point, the Marines had learned bitter lessons. Commanders realized that pre-invasion bombardments, no matter how intense, could not neutralize deeply fortified bunkers. They also saw the critical value of amphibious tractors and tanks in such operations. But those were lessons paid for in blood. By the end of November 22nd, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered nearly 3,000 casualties in just 3 days of fighting. The Marines knew the final confrontation was close. The Japanese pocket on the western tip was still dangerous, but their fate was sealed. The next day would bring the climax of the Battle of Tarawa, a last stand by the defenders, and the final bloody push by the Marines of the 2nd Division. At dawn on November 23, 1943, the endgame on Bidio began. The Marines of the 2nd Division had fought for 3 days in conditions that defied imagination. Now, the Japanese defenders, reduced to a few hundred survivors, were compressed into the western tip of the island. With their commander dead, supplies gone, and no hope of relief, they prepared for a last stand in keeping with the Bushido Code: fight to the death, take as many Americans with them as possible. General Julian Smith ordered a coordinated final assault. The 6th Marines, relatively fresh compared to the battered 2nd and 8th, spearheaded the push. Supported by Sherman tanks, flamethrower units, and demolition squads, they moved methodically westward. The battlefield was a shattered moonscape, bunkers reduced to rubble, palm trees splintered to stumps, and the airfield a scarred strip of torn earth. The fighting was savage, close, and personal. Marines used flamethrowers to blast fire into every opening, often followed by grenades and riflemen to finish what the flames began. Tanks fired point-blank at pillboxes. Engineers crawled forward with satchel charges, risking their lives to destroy fortified strongholds. In many cases, Japanese defenders refused to retreat, staying at their posts until incinerated or buried in collapsed bunkers. One Marine remembered the horror vividly. "You didn't fight men on Tarawa. You fought holes in the ground. You fought shadows. And you had to kill every one of them before you could move another foot." By midday, the Japanese pocket had been reduced to a series of strongpoints clustered along the shoreline. Sporadic counterattacks erupted, often by small groups of soldiers who charged out screaming, wielding bayonets or grenades. Almost all were cut down, but the ferocity of their assaults left a deep impression on the Marines. During one charge, about 50 Japanese soldiers rushed the lines of the 6th Marines. In the confusion, several Marines were killed before tanks swung their turrets and blasted the attackers apart. By the end of the afternoon, resistance was collapsing. What remained of the garrison, a few dozen men, attempted a final suicidal charge just before dusk. The Marines held their ground, mowing down the attackers with rifles and machine guns. When the guns finally fell silent, Bidio was secured. Of the nearly 4,800 Japanese defenders who had manned the island, fewer than 150 were taken alive, most of them Korean laborers or conscripted workers rather than front-line troops. The rest had fought to the death. The cost to the 2nd Marine Division was staggering. In just 76 hours of fighting, over 1,000 Marines and sailors were killed, and nearly 2,300 wounded. The beaches of Tarawa were choked with American dead, their bodies lying in rows where they had fallen. For a single atoll no more than a few square miles in size, the price seemed almost unbearable. News of the battle shocked the American public when photographs and film footage were released. Images of dead Marines sprawled on the sand were some of the first uncensored depictions of American losses in the war. Many questioned whether such sacrifice had been worth it. But military leaders insisted that Tarawa was a necessary proving ground, a brutal but essential step in the island-hopping campaign. For the Marines who survived, there was no doubt about what they had endured. One veteran summed it up with grim simplicity. Tarawa was a name we would never forget. We left too many good men there to ever forget. The Battle of Tarawa ended on November 23rd, but its legacy was only beginning. Lessons learned on those blood-soaked beaches would shape every amphibious assault that followed, from the Marshalls to Iwo Jima. And for the 2nd Marine Division, Tarawa would forever be a defining chapter in its history, a testament to courage under impossible conditions. With the guns silenced on BDO, the 2nd Marine Division was left to count the cost. The battle had lasted just 76 hours, but in that time the division had endured losses almost equal to those of an entire campaign. 1,009 Marines and sailors were killed, 2,101 wounded, and scores more listed as missing. Many of the dead remained unburied for days, lying where they had fallen on the beaches or in the rubble of pillboxes. The tropical heat made recovery grim and hurried. Mass graves were dug in the sand, marked with makeshift crosses of palm wood. For the Japanese, the outcome was annihilation. Of the nearly 4,800 defenders on BDO, only 17 Japanese soldiers and about 129 Korean laborers were taken alive. The island's garrison had done exactly as their orders commanded, fought to the last man. Admiral Shibazaki's boast that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to capture Tarawa proved wrong, but the price paid by the Marines showed he had not been exaggerating by much. When word of the battle reached the United States, the reaction was one of shock. For the first time, graphic images of American dead were released to the public. Life magazine published photographs of rows of bodies washed up on the sand, provoking outrage and sorrow in equal measure. Families who had thought of the Pacific War as distant and abstract suddenly saw its brutal reality. Many questioned whether such a small island had been worth the cost. Military leaders, however, pointed to Tarawa as a necessary trial by fire. The island became a proving ground for amphibious warfare. The Navy and Marine Corps studied every detail, the inadequacy of the pre-invasion bombardment, the critical value of LVTs in crossing reefs, the need for better coordination between infantry, armor, and naval fire support. These lessons were applied almost immediately in the next campaign, the invasion of the Marshall Islands in early 1944, where U.S. forces achieved far more decisive results with fewer losses. For the Marines who fought there, Tarawa was both a crucible and a scar. Survivors spoke of the stench, the heat, the confusion, and above all the courage of their comrades. Stories of heroism, Sergeant William Bordelon clearing bunkers until killed, Lieutenant Bonnyman leading assaults on fortified positions, countless unnamed Marines charging through waist-deep surf, became part of the division's heritage. In later years, Tarawa was remembered not only for its horror but also for what it symbolized. It showed the American people that the road across the Pacific would not be easy, that each atoll and island would demand immense sacrifice. It also proved that the Marines could succeed, even against the most determined resistance. General Holland Matt Smith, overall commander of the operation, later remarked that Tarawa was the toughest fight in the history of the Marine Corps. Veterans of the 2nd Marine Division carried that memory with them for the rest of their lives. Today, BDO is quiet. The palm trees have grown back, and the lagoon is calm again. But relics of the battle remain, rusting tanks half buried in the sand, the remnants of Japanese bunkers, and memorials to those who never left. For the 2nd Marine Division, the name Tarawa became etched in tradition, a reminder of what courage and endurance could achieve in the face of impossible odds. In the broader history of World War II, Tarawa stands as a brutal turning point. It taught the U.S. military how to conduct amphibious assaults against heavily fortified positions, lessons that saved lives in later battles, even as the war grew bloodier. It also forced Americans at home to confront the cost of victory in the Pacific. Above all, it remains a testament to the Marines who fought and died there. Their sacrifice secured a foothold for the Allied advance, and their story continues to echo through the halls of the Marine Corps, a reminder that freedom often comes at a price written in blood and sand.